Australia's strategic environment is dangerous, deteriorating, and deteriorating quickly.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this presentation by the Institute of Public Affairs and Strategic Analysis Australia. We've heard from Peter Jennings about the threat that Australia faces. That video is available on the IPA's YouTube channel. The IPA is a membership-based organisation. We can only hold these sorts of events because of the support of our members. So if you'd like to become a member, please check out our website at ipa.org.au. We'll now move to how we can deal with the threats that are facing Australia, and to look at that, I'll introduce Michael Shoebridge. Michael is also a Director of Strategic Analysis Australia. From 2018 until September 2022, Michael was the Director of the Defence Strategy and National Security Program at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra. Before the think tank world, Michael was a deputy in the Australian Signals Directorate and the Defence Intelligence Organisation. As the first Assistant Secretary for Strategic Policy in Defence, Michael led the team that wrote Australia's 2013 Defence White Paper and also administered defence exports policy and legislation. Michael led the tender evaluation, selection and contract negotiations for the Australian Navy's Armidale-class patrol boats. He was also the head of the Contestability Division that provides objective analysis of the $270 billion defence investment program. Michael has served in both Australia's Finance Department and the Prime Minister's Department, where he was head of the Defence Intelligence and Research Division. Michael will present the Defence Blueprint Australia Needs. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Shoebridge.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the IPA for the fantastic partnership with the Blueprint series. It's our absolute pleasure to be doing this important work with you. And thank you also everyone for turning up. I always think if you're going to say something, it's nice to have people that will listen. So I'm going to cover what urgent action needs to be taken and can be taken to increase Australia's military power, starting in the 3 years from the next term of government. And it really follows on from Peter Jennings' discussion about the threats that Australia and the region face, particularly from an aggressive military power called China. And it is because Australia's strategic environment is dangerous, deteriorating, and deteriorating quickly. As rolled gold statements from both sides of politics when they've been in power have said fairly bluntly. So it was the 2020 Defence Strategic Update under the Morrison government that said there's a big change in defence planning assumptions because of the more dangerous region that we're in. Instead of having at least 10 years before we might have to use our military in a war that is not a war of choice, but a war of necessity, directly affecting Australia and our interests. Instead of having that 10 years luxurious time to prepare and think about it, that warning time had gone, and a conflict, a war in our region, could break out at any time over the next few years. And Peter's given you that Chinese timeline to be ready to fight and win a war by 2027, and told you that they're well on track for that. Then in the 2023 Defence Strategic Review, commissioned as one of the many reviews into defence by Richard Marles, who's the Deputy Prime Minister and also, I think, still the Minister for Defence. That review said again that our region was becoming more dangerous more quickly, and in fact it said it was happening faster and in a more dangerous way than even that 2022 statement from the Morrison government. And then just this year, the National Defence Strategy, which was the follow-on stepchild of the government's Defence Strategic Review, said again in just the 12 months from that last document, our region had got more dangerous still, and yes, we certainly didn't have at least 10 years warning before a war that we would have no choice but to be a participant in. Not because we wanted a war, but because a war had broken out in our region. So if you think about that, between 20 and 2024, there have been increasingly urgent assessments turned into announced government policy that our region has become much more dangerous and war much more likely, and we need to urgently do something about it. But the striking and disturbing thing is in that entire 4 years, despite telling ourselves this with more urgency and more clarity periodically, we have not acted with urgency. In fact, we've just been turning the handle on our defence organisation and our military in a business as usual way, as if time is our friend and we're living in the peaceful time that we all hoped was going to be perpetuity at the end of the Cold War. So the Australian Defence Force and its strategic outlook are in crisis, and urgent action is needed. The next Australian government has to take urgent steps to boost Australian production of weapons, munitions, and other military technology that can supply and equip our military during a credible war that we can all envisage and have been told is credible and possible. And what we produce and equip our military with, to get to something that John Story, our IPA colleague, has said about you don't want to fight the last war. We need to be informed by current conflicts and think about what they mean for future conflicts. And in particular, we need to learn lessons from the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East, and even from the joust between the giant US Navy and the Houthis that's taking place in the Red Sea. There are real lessons and implications for us. And unfortunately, despite the urgent words, we are not showing we're learning those lessons. And to achieve all of this, we need a new approach to rapid defence acquisition, because anyone who's looked at how the Australian Defence Department and Defence Organisation goes about thinking about what it needs, and then the tortuous process of getting what it then thinks it needs, you know that you have an idea 20 years ago, and if you're lucky and you fought the procurement and decision system, in 10 years from now, so 30 years from your original inspiration, you may deliver something. And all the attempts to make this faster have failed, because all the previous attempts have left it to the defence people and officials that are running the existing process to magically decide to change it and make it much faster. But people that are in love with the way they do things aren't the right people to change it. Now, looking at just a simple number, two numbers, $765 billion and 10 years. That $765 billion figure is the current government plan for defence expenditure over the next 10 years, from 2024 to 2034. And the plan that money will be spent on results in an Australian military that is getting weaker over that 10 years. In fact, weaker for at least the next 15 years, and I think into the mid-2030s. So we're going to spend a fire hose of public money on our military, and magically, we're going to have a weaker military. That really needs to change. I mean, it's an incredible result, isn't it? To spend that growing real amount of money and get less military power at a time when we need the opposite. And this is because our military's basic size and structure has been frozen for decades. We've been participating in these wars of choice, which means we've been able to send little penny packets of the force, the ones that we think are most likely to do the job and suffer minimal losses, and be able to plug into our big US allies' logistics and supply system. We haven't had to deploy our own military. We certainly haven't had to support and equip it during a conflict. And the problem with a major war in our region is that our big, powerful friends, particularly our American ally, are going to be flat out looking after themselves resupplying and repairing and replacing their own combat losses. And you know what happens when you're in a crisis? It's just like that airline drill. When a mask falls from the ceiling, look after yourself before assisting those around you. So the Americans will meet their own needs first, and they have major industrial-based problems, which means we will need to do more for ourselves. And we haven't thought like that because of the way we've built our military. The government's Defence Strategic Review of 2023 found the Australian Defence Force was not fit for purpose, and it said that publicly in an unclassified document. And that was because it's in an age of great power competition and in an age of major technological change that is clearly relevant for the battlefield. And what this looks like is our military is equipping itself with ships, planes and armoured vehicles, and eventually submarines, that are getting more and more complicated, more and more expensive, and slower to make, and need to be operated by more and more highly skilled people that take longer and longer to train. I'll give you just an example from the Navy. So when Australia built the Anzac frigates, we built 8 Anzac frigates, 3,600-tonne vessels. They cost $675 million each. About a decade and a half later, we built 3 7,000 tonnes, so twice as big ships, the 7,000-tonne Hobart air warfare destroyers. That cost us about $8.5 billion for 3. So instead of $675 million a ship, they cost us $2.8 billion each. And now we're building 6 Hunter-class frigates, the next generation of warship, and they are going to cost, they're 10,000 tonnes, so half as big again as the air warfare destroyer, and they are going to cost about $7.5 billion each, a total cost for 6 ships of about $47 billion. And this is true across the whole military, across the Army, Navy and Air Force. We build the next generation of something we already have, and it gets much more expensive and much more complex and much slower to produce. And the result is, if these things are used in war, you can't afford to lose them because you haven't got many of them. And if you do lose them, you can't replace them during the period of the war because they take years and years. And worse than that, losing the ship is bad, but losing the crew is worse because they take longer to train and create than the ship or aircraft. So it's not a plan for a war. It's a plan for a long period of peace where you make these tailored small contributions to deployments of choice like East Timor, like Iraq, like Afghanistan. And these prices that keep going up as the complexity of these ships and aircraft and vehicles goes up are making defence a self-bankrupting organisation. There was an ex-head of the Secretary of the US Navy and head of Lockheed Martin, the big US defence firm. He wrote a book called Augustine's Laws. His name is Norman Augustine. And he said eventually the US military, which has exactly the same problem, will be able to afford 1 combat aircraft. And he meant 1 aircraft, he didn't mean 1 type. And it will have to be shared over the week between the Air Force, the Navy and the Marine Corps. So the Marine Corps will get it every second Sunday. That's the problem with that force structure approach of increasingly expensive things. You end up not being able to afford enough of them and you can't operate them. And while these very expensive, complex warships and planes can play a role, we have so few of them that to have any chance of winning in a war, in fact, even operating during a war, and I'm not talking about Australia taking on China by itself. I'm talking about Australia being part of a collective defensive effort to deter war. But if a war happens, fighting in that war, but being able to sustain and support itself in ways we simply haven't planned to do. And to have any chance in such a war, we have to wrap these few really expensive, complex and capable ships, planes and submarines and armoured vehicles, up with all the things we see having an amazingly powerful effect in modern war. And they are the unmanned autonomous systems, drones armed and unarmed, on the land, the sea and the air, that protect, attack and accompany the major systems that you're so familiar with when you think about the military. And the good thing about these smaller systems, and as we see in Ukraine, as we see the Houthis able to do in the Red Sea, is these are completely different to a $2.8 billion major surface ship that if you lose it, you can't replace for years. You can use, lose and replace these cheaper systems very quickly and easily. So you end up being able to have a volume of these things and you can use them and lose them because you can make more of them. So that's about the rapid adoption of autonomous systems for surveillance and for strike on the land, in the air, on and under the sea. And the clear lessons show that if you have these systems, like the Houthis, you can paralyze the world's most powerful navy, the US Navy. The admiral conducting that Red Sea shipping protection mission said a little while ago, the US Navy is fighting its largest battle since the Second World War in the Red Sea against the Houthis. And when I first saw him say that, I thought, what an extraordinary thing to say. How could that be true? And then I thought the most striking thing about it, he was right, it's a high-tempo thing, is that the US Navy is fighting this major battle and it's against an enemy that doesn't have a navy. They're using armed speedboats, cruise missiles, some ballistic missiles they get from Iran, and a whole bunch of cheap drones, armed and unarmed. So, and the Ukrainians have been doing the same thing. They've pushed the Russian Navy out of the Black Sea because they've been sinking things like their flagship, their major warship, the Moskva, with drones and missile combinations. And they've been sinking other surface ships with armed jet skis, remote controlled jet skis, combined with missiles and aerial drones. And they've been destroying submarines, not underwater, but when they're in port. And one of the secrets of submarines, you know how you're told they're mythical, invisible weapons, magical, because you never know where they are? Well, a submarine's a bit like a koala. It spends most of its time asleep. In submarines' case, it's in a port. They spend about 75 to 80% of their time in port and undergoing maintenance. So if you want to kill a submarine, don't try and sneakily find it when it's sneaking about underwater. Kill it when it's in port. And that's what the Ukrainians have been doing. But it's interesting, all this, rapid acquisition, production in Australia of the consumables of conflict and equipping the Australian Defence Force with a range of small, cheap, armed and unarmed drones that are made in Australia and therefore can be resupplied to our military when our supply lines are cut. All of that would be meaningless without addressing the collapsing military workforce, the collapse in numbers across the Navy and the Army, and the bare growth that we see in the Royal Australian Air Force. The Australian Defence Force is meant to have grown by 5,000 permanent service people across the three services since 2017 as a result of the 2016 Defence White Paper. And it's been budgeted, it's been given the money to expand by those 5,000 people. And in that time, it hasn't grown, it's shrunk. It's now 5,000 people short of that growth target. And when you're talking about a permanent military that's just over 58,000 people, 5,000 people is a fair chunk. And that 5,000 was needed to operate the systems and weapons that the military already has. And as the force grows achingly slowly, even more people will be required. In fact, 20,000 more people in total are meant to be required on Defence's conservative estimates to operate the force that is being built so slowly with that $765 billion and the next decade after that. While military numbers have been shrinking, the cost of the military, the workforce, has been rising. So less people, but costing more in total. So each person has been costing more, but the total bill has been going up while the number of people has been going down. And that's an unsustainable thing if you're interested in a budget. And anyone who's facing cost of living pressures would think that's a problem. The other bit of growth that's been happening, the only part of the military that has been growing rapidly, is the hierarchy, the very senior officers. And that has been growing at an extraordinarily rapid rate. So it does show that when there's a will, there's a way. We can do things quickly. It's just unfortunate that it's growing the superstructure and not the people that would actually do any of the fighting. We now have such a top-heavy, complicated military leadership structure, it's hard for the various generals, air marshals and admirals to even know how their jobs relate to each other. In fact, they have to spend a lot of their time trying to understand their own organisation before they do anything engaging with the world or industry, let alone an enemy. And this, combined with our shrinking number of warships, has meant that when we're asked to do things like send a ship to help fight the Houthis, we can't because we're running out of ships and we're retiring them because they're getting too old and fragile before the new ones have turned up. But we can send a team of senior officers to coordinate the ships that others have. And I find that a disturbing, silly outcome. Now, before I stop setting out the problems and start to give you a little bit of hope and some solutions, no matter how, I'll just talk a little bit about the AUKUS submarines. Happy to have a bigger discussion. No matter how well the plan to get 8 nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarines goes, it's taking until the mid-2050s, in fact the plan says about 2054, to get the 8th AUKUS submarine. And that means that even if it's not a mega project, it's a giga project, even if this giga project goes exactly according to plan and you get exactly what's on the tin, Australia needs to have some capabilities and increases in military power in the meantime, because the problem with 8 submarines is if you have 8 submarines, you have 2 that are reliably deployable at any period of time. And our Navy won't have 2 nuclear submarines reliably deployable at any time until 2054, assuming the plan goes well. And that's 30 years from now. And as Peter told you, and as these government documents we've been seeing over the last 4 years have told us, the period of greatest risk is now and the next 10 years. It's not 2054. So whatever we do, we have to increase our military power much faster than the current plan. And we need to get value for money for that $765 billion that we're spending. We should be getting a much more powerful military, not a weaker military for that fire hose of public money. And so this second report in the Blueprint series has 6 main recommendations, and therefore the government, whoever it is, that wins office in this next election, which is not that far away, kind of looks like just after that early March budget next year. So, by May, but sometime between March and May. And what are the 6 recommendations that can make a big difference to our security and grow our military power faster, far faster than the current plan? Well, the first one relates to learning the lessons from the wars we're seeing right now. The federal government has to urgently reopen Australia's embassy in Kiev, and with Ukraine's permission, put a defence and defence industry team there to do 2 things: to provide the Ukrainians with military capabilities that our industry, our medium and small Australian companies, create and build and deliver so well, and that they're doing right now for the Ukrainians just without government support. Things like drones and counter-drone systems, companies like EOS and Defentex and SIPAC, the company that made those Balsa drones, small drones, they're already providing vital military power and capability to the Ukrainians and helping them withstand that Russian attack. But this combined defence organisation and defence industry team wouldn't just rapidly expand what our Australian companies are already giving to the Ukrainians, but they would also build our understanding of the war and how it's being fought, and help us understand what we need to do for our own military to have the kind of offensive and defensive power that those incredibly courageous, successful Ukrainians have been demonstrating every day. So that's the first urgent recommendation. And for all the arguments that we can't possibly reopen that embassy in Kiev because it's just far too dangerous for Australian diplomats and officials, I just wonder how it was possible for us to have an open embassy in Afghanistan during that period of conflict when suicide bombers were roaming around Kabul and trying to kill people and attack embassies, and how it was possible to have our embassy open in Iraq, in Baghdad, which was those embassies were under rocket and mortar fire and suicide bomber attack. We managed to run both those embassies during those nasty periods of danger and conflict, and our officials did a great job. So urgently reopening that embassy in Kiev to both support the Ukrainians and to help ourselves increase our military power seems so obvious, I'm shocked it hasn't happened. The second one, the government should initiate an inquiry by the Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade into lessons from recent conflicts, notably Ukraine and the Middle East and the Red Sea, with a focus on how these lessons should be applied to Australia's circumstances. And to me, that lesson that you don't need a navy to sink a navy. When you're looking at the big Chinese navy, wouldn't it be nice for Xi Jinping to wake up every morning and think, I don't want to go to war because I'm worried my navy will get sunk. Not just by the Australians, but by the Americans and the Japanese and the South Koreans. That's what collective deterrence looks like. And the thing about getting the Parliament's Joint Standing Committee involved is it doesn't leave learning these lessons to the Defence Organisation, because the Defence Organisation has shown itself immune to learning these lessons. It loves its old plan, and no matter what you ask of it, it tells you its old plan is just right. So it needs external authority and direction imposed upon it. And the federal government, the next one, the federal government should establish an initial $1 billion per annum annual fund for rapid acquisition by Defence to buy the key consumables of conflict. We know that in a major war, even our most willing, supportive partners and allies, including America, will be flat out meeting their own needs first. Therefore, we need to be able to supply and support our own military with more things produced here in Australia. And ideally, that production can also support partner and allied forces that are operating out of Australia. But to do that, you need money. Nothing happens without a budget. And at the moment, there's $56.5 billion being spent annually by the Defence Department, rising, as I've told you, over the next 10 years, insisting that $1 billion of that be given in contracts to medium and small Australian firms who we know are already designing and building exactly these weapons and supplying them to the current conflict in Ukraine. That is not just possible, it's essential. And recommendation 4, you'll be pleased there's only 2 more after this. Recommendation 4, the next government has to restore air and missile defence plans and investments that were cut in this year's National Defence Strategy. You know, it's quite interesting. Not many people will have read the strategy. It's an incredibly boring, badly written document. Marcus Hellier and I did a podcast on it called The Numerology of the National Defence Strategy, if you're interested. It's mainly a piece of comedy because the thing is so confusing and nonsensical. But it did have a clear statement that said, Australia's distance and geography no longer protects us from long-range strike. Current technology and emerging technology means Australia can be struck at range by potential adversaries. And then it said, but we're cutting any investment in anti-missile systems, in long-range and medium-range air defence and missile systems. And an official was quizzed about this recently in the Parliament. And he was asked, so why are you spending $6.5 billion building a new battle management system to control air and missile defences, but you're not buying any missiles to fire from this $6.5 billion system? And he said, well, we're waiting for the technology to settle. Well, I have some news. The Ukrainians and the Russians and the Americans and the Japanese and the South Koreans and the Israelis and the Norwegians all have current effective air and missile defence systems. The Israelis have been using them every day. So have the Ukrainians. The thing that isn't settled is the thing they're flushing $6.5 billion down the toilet on, which is this overly complex command and control system. They need to buy some missiles. So that needs to be done rapidly, because it's not good enough to tell the Australian population, you know, our plan to protect you should there be a war and long-range missiles target urban population centres and critical infrastructure, our plan is we have no defence. That is not a plan. And it's not a plan that the population in Ukraine or the population in Israel would accept. Fifthly, the government must direct Defence to publicly report no later than 100 days after the election on the capability impacts of the deferrals, cuts and cancellations that resulted from their 2024 defence strategy and its accompanying investment plan. Because we hear a lot about how it's an integrated focus force and how hard choices had to be made. But it's really just a budget cut driven force. And it has some of these perverse results, like having no protection against air and missile attack in an age where Australia faces those threats. Then that public report about the capability impact will let the new government decide which of those planned capability investments needs to be restored, funded and implemented urgently. And the last one returns to my point about you can have all the weapons in the world you like. You can have these the cheap, the fast and the many, armed and unarmed drones available at numbers, built by amazing Australian companies that help protect those big warships and aircraft. But if you don't have the workforce, you don't have people joining the military, none of that matters. The crisis and collapse in our military workforces across the services is so severe and so damaging to our military that the Prime Minister has to take charge of this and treat it as a national challenge. And that's a challenge for whoever's Prime Minister after the next election. That Prime Minister should convene a high-level group of eminent Australians, some with military experience, but others with much broader, different corporate experiences, to find new ways to grow and sustain our three military services and inspire young Australians to join. And one of the reasons I think young Australians will join our Defence Force is partly because of the dangerous security environment we live in and the knowledge that our military can keep us secure and deter war in such a time, so a sense of purpose. But also if they see our military being equipped with these consumables of conflict and these new, so obviously effective weapons, armed and unarmed drones built by Australian companies, we will be able to say again what old defence recruiting ads used to say: smart people, smart machines. At the moment, a young Australian looking at joining our military thinks they're going to be pretty much in an aged care home, husbanding ageing submarines, ageing frigates, and keeping them alive so that sometime in the future, when these new things turn up eventually, whether it's in the 2040s or 2050s, those who come after them can be smart people operating smart machines. So the workforce crisis can be solved because there's a true purpose there, and young people joining the military should be getting the best technology on the planet, and that can be inherently exciting. So I'll finish here just saying that these 6 recommendations are deliberately focused and practical, and they're focused on what can be done urgently, whoever wins the next election. And they would start to respond to Australia's more dangerous security environment and deliver a military that's able to be used to deter war or to fight a war even within this decade. And unfortunately, that's exactly what Australia's military exists to do. Thank you.